We have two very distinguished guests with us today. We're going to go back to back in getting to just receive from them and learn from them. What a great opportunity for us today to be able to hear from really a brother in Christ who tends to be used in an incredibly fresh way, in a very blunt, honestly, no nonsense kind of way, just in governance in this moment in history. I typically, out of the 85 different, 89, 90, somewhere between 80 to 90 different guests that we have at Convo, get a text from, my boss, from our president, Jerry Falwell Jr., about 2 or 3 different times. So out of the 80, 90 people that we bring in here, whether it's, a comedian like a Tim Hawkins or a Louie Giglio or Hillsong or whatever, typically those are just not micromanaged. But I will say, a couple of times a year, I'll get a text from Jerry, and he'll say, hey, I just heard somebody on the radio, or I just left New York and I met someone there at a meeting and I feel like they should be before our students. Let's get this person at Convo. Well, on that little short list of 2 or 3 is our next speaker today, Congressman Gohmert. Louie Gohmert is a conservative, but yet he leads this nation in very modern ways. What I love about this man is that he's not afraid to fight a good fight. He's not afraid to stand for truth. He's not afraid to really stand for liberty and the very things that make this country great. But he always doesn't just point out the problems. If you've ever seen him on TV, if you ever YouTubed and watched videos of him, he always tends to be the kind of leader who doesn't just say this is wrong, but then he gives solutions. A lot of people will come to a meeting with you and they'll tell you all the things that are wrong that need to be corrected, but they never bring solutions. And one of the very great things about this gentleman that we have that's going to kind of pour into you today is that he's actually a problem fixer. He is from Texas. This is his 6th, come on, y'all, Texas. This is his 6th consecutive time to serve in Congress. He's a devout believer. He's actually a deacon at his church in Tyler, Texas, at Green Acres Baptist Church. So that's just great. Just a faithful servant, a devoted husband, a great dad, and honestly a friend to liberty. And I'm just so excited about just getting to sit, and just learn from him. And so you can just thank President Falwell for this great advice to have him. Sir, we're honored to have you. We want you to know you're at home today. We love you, and we're grateful for the way that you just shine bright for the kingdom and all over governance. Can we put our hands together? Come on, everybody, for Congressman Gohmert.
Thank you. Wow, what a treat to be here. I'm not kidding. Sometimes when you're talking to members of Congress, they're all sitting there. I don't know if you know Jerry Jones, he's the owner of the Dallas Cowboys. Sometimes actually, I owe a lot to Jerry because when I was growing up in East Texas, I was just the biggest Dallas Cowboy fan. But then when he bought them and the way he fired Tom Landry, it kind of freed me up. If I see him, great. If I don't, I'm live with that too. But before that, I used to feel like, if a preacher went beyond noon and the Cowboys had a noon kickoff and go, hey, this is not your time anymore. This is Cowboy time. Let's get home. Come on. So anyway, I've been freed up from that, and now there are a lot of teams. I pull more for the individuals on the team. I never thought I'd ever pull for the Washington Redskins, but hey, and it grieves me to see Robert Griffin III hurt. He is such a great guy. He's one of the smartest, classiest guys, selfless. So I pulled more for the guy. I saw a guy from Texas A&M named Tannehill. Unfortunately, the Miami Dolphins didn't win last night. But anyway, I pull more for the individual when I know that they're really good people. But I feel like God has a way of preparing us for things that are in the future. I didn't expect to be in Congress when I was in high school or college or law school. I owed the Army 4 years from a scholarship I had at A&M, and I never thought that, I'm going to be in Congress someday. But it became very clear to me back when I was a practicing attorney in Tyler, Texas, and I never brought this up when I was running, but my mother was just brilliant. She put herself through Baylor in 2.5 years, and her parents couldn't help her, but they lived right by campus, so she worked full-time and put herself through. She was just brilliant. She was found to have a brain tumor, and they said it may take a year, may take 20 years before it eventually takes her. It took 15. But all through the 80s, she would say, son, you know, God meant for you to be a public servant, and you'd be a good judge. And I go, Mother, I don't want to be a judge. You know, I don't want to sit around and listen to half the lawyers around here. Some of them aren't that good, and I make a lot more money than a judge does. I don't want to do that. But after she passed away in January of 91, started thinking about things my smart mother used to say. And a few months, 3 or 4 months later, I had a civil case. I was representing a woman, maybe 40 or so, in a breach of contract case. And we'd had a preliminary hearing, trial coming up in about 10 days or so. And my legal assistant said, the judge is on the phone. I said, really? Is the other lawyer on there? Because you're not supposed to have a conversation with a judge about a case unless the other side's represented. She said, just the judge. And so I said, well, hello, Judge. Say, he said, that's a mighty fine-looking woman you had in my court the other day. You think she'd go out with me? Okay, some of you may not realize that's really not appropriate, okay? A judge is not supposed to date somebody that's about to go to trial in front of them, okay? So anyway, I said, well, I don't know, Judge. All I know is she's married. Even though her husband works in Dallas, she's married. That's all I can tell you. Oh, well, I just didn't know if maybe you could help me with this deal. I sure can't. And I hung up, and I knew we needed a new judge. We elect our judges in Texas, and I hoped and prayed that somebody would step up and run. And I talked to people all over town, lawyers that might run, and tried to persuade some of them. Nobody would, so I ended up, my wife and I prayed about it from about June through November, file in December, and we ended up Thanksgiving. We just had a real peace. I think this is what you're supposed to do. So I ran for it, and the first thing I had to do, we had about 1,000 people that were out on bond awaiting trial. That list had just gotten longer and longer, and I promised, you elect me, I'll move the backlog of all these felony cases. So first thing I had to do is have a huge hearing where I would call one defendant and his lawyer up after another, and all I had to do is get on the record that this was the defendant in this case and that they understood the day and time of their trial. And that way, if they don't show up to trial, I issue a warrant for their arrest. They get arrested and put in jail. And it's amazing, when people are in jail, they get ready for trial a lot quicker than when they're not in jail. But I don't know how that worked. But anyway, so we were having a hearing, a docket call. I would call the case, lawyer would come up, I'd say, are you the defendant so-and-so? He'd have to acknowledge audibly so the tape and the court reporter could pick it up that he was, and say, all right, your trial date is such and such date, 9 a.m., this courtroom, you got that? And they'd have to respond audibly. And so I was running through them pretty fast, and called one case, the defendant and his attorney came up, and I said, are you the defendant so-and-so? And before he could speak, his lawyer said, Judge, my client's deaf, so we're going to need an interpreter for the trial. And so that's fine. We'll have an interpreter for the trial. We'll have an interpreter for every other hearing. But today, all I got to do is make sure he knows when his trial date is. That's all. So I looked him in the eye and I said, can you read my lips? And he looked me in the eye and went, now, I didn't realize at the time, but that was preparing me to be in Congress, where people will look you in the eye and just flat out lie to you. And so I didn't know that was coming. But I was telling a great president, Jerry Falwell, I didn't know, I never got to meet his father, but I was young and I was so grateful to the Falwells for stepping up, taking all the slings and arrows, trying to help get our country on track. Started something y'all have heard, read, the moral majority, and it was a majority. It was. But today, people say, including our president, this is not a Christian country, and I won't debate that. I don't think it is anymore, but I know how it started. And by the way, a little background. I love the instruments. I love the guitars. And a mandolin. Wow, who has a mandolin? That's fantastic. But all these instruments, I just love it. And if you go to the Old Testament, you see all the instruments that David would have when they were praising God. But I grew up in East Texas, a little town called Mount Pleasant, and I accepted Christ when I was 6. Some people thought that was too young, but y'all, I have prayed for the clarity of faith I had the night I accepted Jesus. It's just unencumbered, pure faith. And the older you get, the more cobwebs and things go around. But anyway, our church, a little stiff, is Southern Baptist Church. And I was thinking about that. I always make an outline of what I'm going to cover, and then I pray that God will help me forget the things I shouldn't say and then bring to mind the things I should. And I don't always get that right, but I'm still working on it. But anyway, I remember I learned to play guitar when I was 8, and it was something I was just excited about, wanted to do. And so when I'm in high school, we had a youth director. He and I, every other Sunday afternoon, would go to the local jail, and they'd take us up to the 3rd floor where they had the place where they used to hang people, and I always thought that was rather ominous. That was right beside the cell door, the big cell where we'd go in and have a service. I'd bring my guitar, and it was a Gibson, a little different from that one, but I would do some hymns, and then Steve would do a sermon. We'd have church every other week. Well, that was okay with my dad, but then we were going to have a Christmas service, and I got my guitar case and started to head for the car, and my dad said, "Where are you going with that?" So, well, I'm going to church. They've asked me to play Silent Night accompanying on the guitar. And he said, and I love my dad. He says, I love him to death. He's just a great guy, but a little bit stoic when it comes to these things. And he said, "Son, the church is no place for the guitar." And I said, "Well, Dad, the first time Silent Night was played in church, it was to a guitar accompaniment." He said, "Not here." As I was standing over here, there's such a great feeling in Vine Center here, isn't there? I mean, don't you feel it? Just such a great feeling. Well, 2 or 3 of you feel like there's a great feeling. Well, that's a good thing. You okay? You feel like it's good? Okay. But I'd heard about this guy that came into our church. Story was told, and nobody'd seen him before, wasn't dressed all that well, went right up toward the front. And when the preacher was preaching, he'd jump up and say, "Praise the Lord, amen." And just, oh, hallelujah. He'd just jumping up, yelling stuff the whole sermon. And finally, one of the head deacons came down and said, "Sir, you're going to have to stay seated and keep your mouth shut." He said, "I can't help it. I got the Spirit in me." He said, "I don't care what you got. You didn't get it here." Well, I think here, Jerry, I think you could get the Spirit here, right? This is just so wonderful. Well, and I appreciate you sitting here patiently. I've got 3 wonderful girls, and my wife and I have been married 37 years, but I tell them, my wife still has my name on Google Alert, and I tell them all, take that off. You're not going to like what comes up most of the time. But you know I'm not as crazy as they make me out to be. But one of those crazy things occurred back November of 2012. I knew we needed a new Speaker of the House. We had just gotten a little bigger majority. We won the majority in 2010. And I used the nomination speech as a chance to lay out all the broken promises and failed leadership since our leader, who was about to be elected Speaker again, had. And I knew that I didn't even have a second, but I knew I need to use this. I've been praying about it. I was sitting on the aisle about 2/3 of the way back in our meeting, and I was like, Lord, I don't even have a second. I mean, but it turned into such a pep rally. I knew you got 100 or so guys here that are new within the last 2 years. You need to tell them what's been going on. So when the chairman of the conference said, nomination has been made and seconded, John Boehner be Speaker, any other nominations? Hearing none, I went, and I was already up to the front by that point. And I said, Mr. Chairman, and he looked at me, he's a great guy, he looked at me, this looked like, oh, please don't do this. But I have a nomination. Well, I ended up nominating Newt Gingrich at the very end, but the purpose was to lay out the failed leadership, thinking these people need to know the broken promises. Well, I know my family got Google alerts last January. There were a group of 9 of us that had been trying for 3 weeks to get to 29 people who would vote for someone else besides the current Speaker. And if everybody was voting and we had 29 vote for somebody else, then that would mean nobody got a majority. And under House rules, you have to get a majority to be Speaker. And we knew if we kept our current Speaker from getting a majority, that would throw it to a second ballot for the first time since the 1920s. And then we would have an emergency conference. People would be mad at me and some of the other guys, but then we could reach a compromise and have a compromise Speaker. That was the goal. And guys got pretty upset that we were trying to do this, but a lot of Republicans were telling the Speaker, you know, I'm with you, I'm all in for you, and you promised me I could get on this committee, you promised me I could be this chairman, and you know, I'm with you all the way. And then constituents were burning up the phone saying elect somebody else, and many of them were saying, look, I would vote for anybody else if somebody announced, but I'm not just going to throw my vote away when nobody's announced. So we've been trying for 3 weeks. We couldn't get more than 9. And so we had a conference call, and a guy from Oklahoma, Jim Bridenstine, and a guy from Kentucky. Anybody from Kentucky? Great state. Anyway, Thomas Massey, I love Thomas. Even though he was educationally challenged, he went to MIT, you know, he did, you know, smart guy though, even though he went to MIT. But anyway, Thomas and Jim are making the case, Louie, you need to announce you're running for Speaker. And I said, guys, if I announce I'm running for Speaker, then instead of talking about failed leadership, broken promises, and how now 61% of Republicans across the country want a new Speaker, it'll all of a sudden be the Republican establishment and the Democrat establishment talking about this crazy fool from Texas, and the focus needs to be on leadership. And I don't think we ought to do that. Anyway, others said, no, Louie, you're the only guy of our 9 that could announce and get all the talk shows and Fox News all involved, so we need you to announce. Well, Thomas and Jim had told me that the night before, and I said, well, let's wait and talk about it in the morning. So I prayed about it overnight, and when they were making the case, I said, look, guys, the only way I could do that is if one of you announced, and then I could announce after that and say, see, it's not about me. Somebody else announced yesterday. We're hoping somebody else will announce. It's not about me. It's about getting a new Speaker. And so Ted Yoho from Florida, that's a good state. I love the beaches. But, well, Ted Yoho says, Louie, and Ted, big guy, veterinarian, and, you know, in his case, God prepared him from Washington because he was a big animal vet. He knew about how to deal with the south end of a northbound horse. And so he was perfect in coming to Washington, you know, he just already prepared. So anyway, Ted said, well, Louie, if that's all it'll take to get you to announce for speaker, then I'll send out a press release, announce today. I said, okay, Ted, you do that. I'll call Fox News, see if they'll let me on in the morning. They did. And then I'll get on talk shows on Monday. So that's what happened. And within 24 to 36 hours, we went from 9 to 24 solid, but actually we had 40. If everybody kept their word, we had 40 or 50. But then the morning of the election, it got crazy, and a lot of promises were made, and we ended up with 24. So people were angry. They couldn't believe that this idiot from Texas took away their excuse. They were able to tell the Speaker of the House, the most powerful guy on Capitol Hill, I'm all with you, and placate their constituents by saying, nobody's announced. Well, I announced, not for an ego trip, as many in the mainstream media would say. In fact, there was an article in one of the Washington papers that actually got it right. They said, this is incredible. A guy announces for speaker, and he's overheard telling his other Republicans, look, you know Boehner will be mad if you don't vote for him. And you know he'll be doubly mad if you vote for me. Don't vote for me. We need 29 people to vote for somebody else. That keeps anybody from getting a majority. We have an emergency conference, and we work out a compromise. And so I think the best way I can explain what I was doing was there was a guy that bred and developed the biggest, meanest dog that you could possibly have. And he trained him to be mean and ferocious, and just no person or no dog could take this guy on. He just too powerful and ferocious. Well, one day the guy gets a knock on the door, and he had a huge fence, and he let the dog run around in the yard, and he couldn't believe somebody got past the dog. He opens the door, and there's a little elderly lady standing there, and she said, I'm so sorry to tell you, my dog just killed your dog. And he said, I don't think so. She said, yes, it's true. I'm so sorry. And he said, well, what kind of dog you got? She said, she's a little Pekingese. And he goes, there is no way your little Pekingese killed my big dog. She said, I'm sorry, but that's what happened. He said, now how would your little Pekingese have killed my ferocious fighting dog? And she said, she got stuck in his throat. Well, see, that's all I was trying to do. I was trying to be the little Pekingese that got stuck in the big dog's throat so that somebody else could have a chance to get it. So it wasn't an ego trip. It wasn't that I was as crazy as people say I am. And I've been called everything in the book. And I don't think it was anybody here at Liberty. I don't believe anybody from Virginia, but one person called me a moron and misspelled moron. You know, there's no E in moron, okay? It's just not. So anyway, but I've thought so often, I don't hear Michael Card get played as much, but he wrote songs like El Shaddai, but an amazing songwriter, but he wrote one that I just love called God's Own Fool. And the words go, it seems I've imagined him all of my life as the wisest of all of mankind. But if God's holy wisdom is foolish to man, he must have seemed out of his mind. He says, when we in our foolishness thought we were wise, he played the fool, he opened our eyes. When we in our weakness believed we were strong, he became helpless to show we were wrong. So we follow God's own fool, for only the foolish can tell. To be beyond believable, come be a fool as well. 1 Corinthians first chapter, 18 says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God." Then further down it says, "Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." So, you become a fool. There's a lot of freedom in that. And I just can't tell you what a thrill it is to be here. Since I've been in Congress, my alma mater, I think, is afraid to have a conservative back. And we were talking about that. You've had Bernie Sanders here, you know. That's an amazing thing. Conservatives are not afraid of debate. You know, we're not afraid to have dialogue. And Christians, you know, not just conservatives, Christians are not normally, you're not afraid of a debate. I mean, we'll talk to anybody. The Apostle Paul, you know, he goes into a hostile crowd. "Hey, let me tell you about that unknown God that you're paying tribute." I mean, that should be us. Not afraid to go. But it seems like as people who claim to be liberal take over universities, there's no room for disagreement. Now, my parents told me that a preacher back in the early 50s, before I came along, used to, when he was talking about married couples, he'd say, if two people agree on everything, one of them's unnecessary. I mean, really. And I would use that at some of our deacons' meetings. We were the biggest church of any kind east of Dallas and north of Houston. We now have, well, I'm not even going to talk about, over 10,000, about 15,000 members in a little town of 90,000. It's pretty amazing, but it's a mission-minded church. But I used to, when I was on the active duty, the active deacon list, we had some pretty nasty arguments, and people would call people names, and others say, we ought to be in agreement on everything. I said, no, if everybody agrees on everything, all but one's unnecessary. We need to have disagreement unless there's one person here who has 100% lock on God's truth. Otherwise, we need to prayerfully consider and talk and hear differing opinions. It's how we got a Constitution. You know, they argued for nearly 5 weeks, a lot of rancor, yelling, and then it was then that the 80-year-old Ben Franklin stood up and basically said, you know, we've been going for 5 weeks. We got more no's than ayes on virtually every vote. How has it happened, sir? We know exactly what he said because he wrote it out for us. How has it happened, sir, that we have not once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? In the beginning contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room. Our prayers, sir, were heard and they were graciously answered. He went on to explain how actually everybody in there should remember prayers they'd prayed during the Revolution, and now here in 1787, they ought to be doing it again. And in fact, though most people these days are taught he was a deist that doesn't believe in God the way we do, his own words betray that. He's 80 years old. He's a couple of years away from meeting his maker. And yes, he enjoyed the company of women in Europe, England, but he's 80. He's got gout. He's got arthritis. He has overweight, has trouble getting up and down. But he says, I have lived for a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth. God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his aid, is it possible an empire could rise without his assistance? We've been assured, sir, in the sacred writing that unless the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. So I firmly believe this. I also firmly believe without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in our political building no better than the builders of Babel. And he goes on to make a motion that they begin each day with prayer like the Continental Congress did. And I was listening to my friend Sean Hannity one day, and I didn't realize it was a replay, and I called in to their producer. I said, Lauren, is this a replay? He said, yeah. I said, oh, okay. Well, I was going to give Sean some ammunition against this guy. I said, they voted that motion down. Yes, they did, but if you go back and look at the debate, the point was, in the Continental Congress, we had a treasury, we had money. We're not getting paid, we got no treasury, we got nothing. And the only way we had prayer every day, we didn't trust, especially some of the Quakers, they didn't trust anybody to do a fair prayer, right? Isn't that all we want, a fair prayer? Y'all have had good fair prayers here, right? So that's all we were looking for. But we don't have any money to hire a chaplain, so we're going to have to wait until we get this Constitution worked out. So that failed, but then Randolph stands up and said, okay, all right, I make a motion. Here we are at the end of June. We're about to celebrate our country's birthday. I move that we recess and we all come worship together at the same church. And then after that, we come back and try to do that. Now, that one passed. And they went to the Reformed Calvinistic Church, and a preacher named Rogers did an awesome job. And when they reassembled after that, some said it was a new spirit in the room, and it allowed them to get the great compromise and give us the greatest founding document in any nation's history. So some of those guys played the fool, and they weren't afraid of doing it. And as a result, we got the greatest, most blessed country, more freedoms, more opportunity, but those are suffering these days. I'm seeing our freedoms go away. Government, let's see, we're told, gee, the NSA can get everybody's your emails. They get logs of everybody's phone call. We got to stop that. When I was a judge, if you wanted somebody's messages, bank records, medical records, you had to come satisfied with sworn evidence that somebody had probably committed a crime, so probable cause, and only then would I sign the warrant letting you get it. Now, after Obamacare, the federal government's getting everybody's medical records. I don't want them to have my medical records. They got nothing to hide, but that's not their business. And we now have the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, and they're trying to grab everybody's debit and credit card information. That's not their business. They say, oh, yeah, we need all that because that way we can monitor in case they're mistreated by a bank. Well, if I get mistreated by a bank, I'll tell you, you don't need to take all my records. But the privacy is going, more and more government control. I took a lot of abuse in Washington when I said it, but said the only thing Orwell got wrong was the year. It wasn't 1984. But Big Brother's watching. Yeah. And who would have ever dreamed that the United States would betray Israel so many ways? And it's happening as we speak. It's outrageous. It's not a good, if you believe in the Bible, being a betrayer of Israel. I've looked for a verse that said those who betray Israel will be blessed. I can't find it, so I'm really worried because we keep betraying them. But here I am, guy from a little town in East Texas, and I've been to Israel a number of times. I love the Prime Minister Netanyahu, and a couple of years ago I was over there, and there were 4 members of Congress, and Netanyahu knew how much we love and support Israel, so he agreed to meet with us, even though he finished meeting with the Chinese ambassador at 7. He had a speech to give at 8:30. His assistant said he can only spend 15 minutes because he's got to write his speech for 8:30. It's before his entire party, and they're mad at him. And so, anyway, it was made, but we went till about 8:15. It was kind of tough. But I said, when it was just us in the room, I said, well, I'm sorry. The ambassador kept begging to be in the room, and I knew he had instructions from Washington. Don't let Gohmert and those people talk to him without you being there. We got to know what these nuts are saying. But anyway, I was unimpeded. I said, look, I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago when we were having a conversation here at the real capital in Jerusalem, not the one in Tel Aviv, but the real capital of Jerusalem, I said, I told you 2 things, and I want to remind you. Number one, there's never been a time in Israel's history when they've given away land trying to buy peace that land wasn't used as a staging area from which to attack it. He said, oh yeah, I'm going to use that in my speech tonight. And I said, well, it's true. I understand you want peace, but you're not going to get it by giving away land. They always use it as a place to attack you from every time you've done that. And I said, the other thing is, I told you then, I still believe this. I'm not a prophet. I know the Bible. I know history. I think you've got a chance to be one of Israel's great leaders. And my friend Michelle Bachman said, Louie, he is one of Israel's great leaders. And I said, no. I'm talking about all-time greats. David, Solomon, people like Josiah, Hezekiah for most of it till right then, but even Ben Gurion, but they all knew the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And no leader has called upon the nation of Israel to pray and fast as a nation. And I said, look, I know you've got the secularists. I called some of the names of people that were just so harassing to him. And I said, I know they're secularists. They'll be mad if you do this, but our presidents used to do it all the time. And it ought to be happening here. And it scares me, but you're going to have some crises in this country. And I'm afraid that the United States may help provoke them. But that's a real opportunity for you to do a proclamation and say, look, for those secularists that don't believe in God, fine. But if you do, I call upon you to have a time of prayer and fasting and pray for our nation and pray that God will protect us. And I said, I promise you, if you will do that, God will answer those prayers, and all those secularists that make fun of you, they will see that God answered the prayer. I promise you. And anyway, he said, well, I don't know, you probably weren't aware, but since you said that, I've started a Bible study at my home. And I said, I had read that and heard that. I could not be more thrilled. And he said, okay, here's something you don't know. Since then, my favorite hour of the week is when my son and I sit down together, read Scripture, and talk about it. It's my favorite hour of the week. Now, his family, as I understand it, was not spiritual, was not religious growing up. It's a huge development. And one of the other with us, when we got down to the van after the meeting, he has worked for some of the great people in the Christian movement, and including Billy Graham. And he said, I'm texting my wife. That was incredible. This guy from East Texas is telling the leader of Israel he's got to start, calling upon God. And he said, that was awesome. It was a biblical moment. I'm just a bald-headed goose from East Texas, But God likes to use the earthen vessels for some reason. And I guess it's because when he uses somebody like me, he gets the credit, because there's nothing about who I am or what I am. But let me just quickly mention, we're in danger. 28 U.S. Code 455, the law is very clear, it's unequivocal. Any justice, judge, or magistrate judge of the United States shall disqualify himself in any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. We had two judges, Ginsburg, Kagan, who performed same-sex marriages. There's no question that they were not impartial. They were very partial. And they made that clear by what they did and what they said. They were disqualified from sitting on the case that would decide whether same-sex marriage was going to be legal. Now, it's bad enough that the Supreme Court has said over the years, you can't have prayer in public, you can't be talking about God in public, all this craziness when you know our history. But in the case on same-sex marriage, whether you agree or disagree, it's not hard to find. Even if you're one of the few folks here that don't believe there is a God, Moses believed in God, and Moses said, God gave me this word, and the word is that a man shall leave his father and mother, and a woman leave her home, and the two will become one flesh. And then Jesus himself, when he was asked about divorce, marriage, he said, he quoted Moses exactly verbatim. And then he added a line, and what God's joined together, let nobody separate. So if you believe there's a God, you believe Moses knew something about that God, you think Jesus knew something about that God, he was God, he was one, the three are one, then you got to understand there is something to this foundational thing called marriage. And I took some grief recently. I was being interviewed for C-SPAN in their private interview early, and she was asking me questions, and it always lights up our phone when I talk about the Bible or anything about things Christians believe. And I said, well, let's just take a totally secular approach to this. Congress is good about having studies. How about if we take 4 heterosexual couples and put them on an island where they have everything they need to live and exist, and we take 4 couples of just men, put them on an island where they have all they need to survive, and then let's take 4 couples of just women and put them on an island, and then let's come back in 100 years and see, which one nature favors. Just see, let's just see which. Alexander Hamilton said, for my own part, I sincerely esteem it a system which, without the finger of God, never could have been suggested or agreed upon by such a diversity of interests. Patrick Henry said, it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. For this very reason, peoples of all other faiths have been afforded asylum, prosperity, and freedom of worship here. You try to have freedom of worship under any other system except Judeo-Christian principles, it won't work. You're going to lose your freedoms at some point. And the Church of the Holy Trinity decided 1892, it's over 100 years after our founding. The Supreme Court goes on to describe all the things about Christianity in this nation and said, it finishes by saying the churches and church organizations which abound in every city, town, hamlet, the multitude of charitable organizations existing everywhere under Christian auspices, the gigantic missionary associations with general support and aiming to establish Christian missions in every quarter of the globe. These and many other matters which might be noticed add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a Christian nation. I agree with the president. I don't think it is anymore. But Thomas Jefferson, it's inscribed inside his memorial there in Washington. God who gave us life, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Jesus said, John 10, my Father who has given them to me is greater than all. No one is able to snatch them from my Father's hand. Let me just close with this. These are trying times, and it breaks my heart that you don't have the freedoms right now I did when I was growing up. You don't? And it's getting worse all the time. Over 70% of Americans say they don't believe the next generation will have the opportunities that this generation had. Although I did hear a Christian comedian, not a Christian comedian, but a young female comedian in her 20s, and she said, can you believe all this stuff about we're not going to have it as good as our parents? Isn't that ridiculous? How can we not live as good as our parents when we're all still living with our parents? That doesn't make sense. I thought she had a point. But anyway, if we don't get back on track and acknowledge where our freedoms came from, you're not going to have them. And I'm telling you, when the slings and arrows come, and they do, didn't come when I was a kid growing up. Jesus said, you'll suffer for my sake. I never suffered for Jesus' sake, not growing up. People didn't want to admit they weren't a Christian back then when I was growing up in East Texas. So you don't suffer for Jesus' sake in that, but Christians are now the only organization, they're now the only group of people who it's okay to be politically biased against. And it gets so frustrating. And there's so many times I've prayed, and by the way, some people like to pray standing. Oh, we got to stand up to pray, or we got to kneel to pray. I'm telling you, God's heard my prayers. Flat on my face, hanging from a rope 40 feet up, he's heard my prayers in all kinds of positions. It's the position of your heart that allows him to hear. So keep that in mind, but let me just finish this example. When my wife was pregnant with our first daughter, I'm so lucky, 3 incredible daughters, but our first daughter decided to try to come very prematurely. And she 8 to 10 weeks premature, and I love we got somebody that loves preemies. That's awesome. But at the time, she came so early, was so small, we didn't know if we were going to get to keep her. And my wife had been in the hospital. They were trying to stop labor for 3 days, and that was in Tyler. And our pediatrician, they were losing her, and so they kept increasing the oxygen, which can risk blindness. And I knew all of that, and I knew all of those risks. And he says, we're the second level, but we got to get your child to the first level. We're losing her. And I said, what do you suggest? Well, we got to go to Dallas or Shreveport. And now everybody just has to go to Dallas because of insurance. But back then, I said, well, which way should we go? He said, I don't know. Shreveport seems to have a higher survivability rate. And I said, let's go to Shreveport. And then I was torn. Do I stay with Kathy here in the hospital in Tyler? Do I go with our baby? And Kathy says, go. You do anything you can for our child. So I followed the ambulance over to Shreveport, and I met the neonatologist, a guy named Singh, T-S-I-N-G, and he was telling me it's so important that you talk to your child and you caress your child. Her eyes don't work very well. She can't see you. You're just a blur, but she knows your voice. She's heard your voice from in the womb for all these months now. She knows your voice. Talk to her. So they brought me a stool. I'm sitting by her isolette. Got all the diodes and electrode, all those things hooked up and all that. And her breath, the lungs are not properly developed. It's really shallow, erratic breathing, heart rate erratic and very fast. And anyway, they said, you can sit, you can't stay more than 2 hours. You have to leave every 2 hours, but talk to her, caress her, and I did. And at one point, I had my finger down by her tiny little hand, and she wrapped her hand around my finger, just the end here, and held on. Wouldn't let go. And in a little while, Dr. Singh came up, put his hand on my back, said, have you noticed the monitors? And I hadn't. I'd been talking to my daughter. And I looked up and he said, still very shallow breathing, fast heart. They've stabilized. They're not erratic. They've stabilized. He said, she is drawing strength from you. I ended up being there for about 8 hours and they made me leave. But I'm telling you, we're in the Lord's hand. Jesus said, nobody can snatch you out. And I'm telling you, when you have some of the days when your closest friends are so angry at you, there's one thing to do. Let's grab a hold of God's finger and hang on for dear life, and he will give you strength for the day. God bless you all. Thank you.